Some people judge by status. Others learn too late that talent knows no class. Sophia sat quietly in the back of the music room, gripping the violin case in her lap. Her father had worked at this prestigious academy as a janitor for years, cleaning floors, while students in pressed uniforms walked past him without a glance. She had grown up in the shadows of their grand hallways, always invisible, always an outsider. Today, that changed. It started as a joke. A group of rich students had snickered during music class, whispering to their teacher, Sophia should play violin. She grew up here after all. Maybe she picked up something from cleaning the practice rooms. The teacher smirked, amused by the idea. All right, Sophia, why don't you show us what you've learned? Laughter rippled through the room, but Sophia ignored it. She walked to the front, standing tall as she pulled out her violin. Hands steady, heart pounding. She placed the bow against the strings and began to play. And within seconds, the room fell into shocked silence. The sound that filled the air wasn't the screeching noise they expected. It was something else, something breathtaking. The notes soared through the classroom, deep, rich, filled with emotion. The laughter died instantly, jaws dropping as the music wrapped around them, commanding attention in a way words never could. Sophia wasn't just playing, she was telling a story through each note, a story of long nights spent practicing in the empty halls after her father finished work, a story of silent dreams that had never been given a chance to be spoken, a story of talent that had been overlooked until now. By the time she finished, no one dared to speak. The teacher stood frozen, eyes wide. The students who had mocked her sat motionless, their faces pale. Sophia lowered her violin, letting the final note linger in the stunned silence. She met the teacher's gaze and said softly, "I didn't just learn this from cleaning practice rooms." The news of her performance spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, the headmaster himself requested to see her. Sophia walked into his office, standing tall as he studied her carefully. Finally, he spoke. "You never mentioned you could play at this level." Sophia met his gaze unflinching. "No one ever asked." The headmaster leaned forward, fingers tapping against his desk. "We have an upcoming competition, a prestigious event with the top young musicians in the country. Represent our academy and your education here will be fully paid for." Sophia's breath caught. A full scholarship? She had never dared to dream of such an opportunity. She nodded once. "I accept." The night of the competition arrived. Sophia stepped onto the grand stage, facing an audience filled with elite musicians, judges, and students from rival academies. Many of them looked at her with doubt. Who was this unknown girl standing among prodigies? Then she lifted her violin and began to play. And this time, she didn't just silence a classroom. She silenced an entire auditorium. The music poured from her soul, weaving through the air, leaving even the most skeptical judges leaning forward, captivated. By the time she played the final note, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Among them were her classmates, the same ones who had laughed at her, the same teacher who had mocked her. They weren't laughing anymore. They were watching in pure regret. When the results were announced, the head judge's voice rang through the auditorium. "The winner of this year's competition is Sophia Carter." Tears burned in her eyes as the crowd erupted in applause. She turned her head, searching for the one person who had always believed in her. And there, in the back, standing tall with pride in his eyes, was her father, the janitor. Sophia clutched the trophy close to her chest because she knew this was just the beginning. Some people had laughed at her, some had doubted her, but in the end, she had let her talent speak for itself. And now the whole world was listening. Some people think talent belongs to the privileged, but true greatness comes from those who refuse to be ignored. Sophia stood backstage gripping the trophy in her trembling hands. The cheers of the audience still echoed in her ears, but all she could focus on was one person. Her father stood near the exit in his janitor's uniform, his eyes shining with pride. He didn't clap or cheer. He just smiled in that quiet way that told her everything he felt. She had done it. She had proven them all wrong. As she stepped off the stage, students from her academy rushed toward her. The same students who had once mocked her, now their faces were filled with awe. "Congratulations, Sophia. That was incredible. I had no idea you could play like that." She met their gazes, calm, steady. "You never cared enough to ask." Their smiles faltered, a realization dawning on them. But before anyone could respond, the headmaster appeared, gesturing for her to follow him. The next morning, Sophia sat in the headmaster's office, across from a group of prestigious music directors. Judges from the competition had personally reached out to recommend her for an elite music conservatory. These were opportunities given only to the best, the ones who had been trained in private academies since childhood. Yet here she was, the janitor's daughter, being offered a future she never thought possible. The headmaster folded his hands, watching her carefully. "Sophia, your talent is undeniable. The academy wants to fully sponsor your musical education. We will ensure that you have everything you need to become a world-class violinist." Sophia exhaled slowly, processing the weight of his words. A full scholarship, private lessons, a path to a career she had only dreamed about. She should have been thrilled, but something inside her hesitated. She had spent years being invisible to these people. Now they saw her only because she had forced them to. Did she really want to accept their kindness after they had spent so long ignoring her? That evening, Sophia returned to the Academy's music hall, standing in the empty room where it had all started. This was where she had been mocked, dared to play as a joke, and unknowingly changed the course of her life. She lifted her violin, closing her eyes as she let the music fill the space. The door creaked open, and she turned to see her father standing there. He held a folded piece of paper in his hand, something fragile and old. He walked toward her, placing it gently on the piano. "You should read this." Sophia unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the faded ink. It was a letter of recommendation from years ago, addressed to her father from a renowned violinist. The words made her throat tighten. "Your daughter has an exceptional gift. If nurtured, she will one day play for the world. But talent without opportunity is a flower without sunlight. I hope she gets her chance." She looked up in shock. "Dad, what is this?" Her father sighed. "I took you to a music teacher when you were little. He saw your talent immediately. But lessons were expensive and we couldn't afford them, so I did what I could. I made sure you were always surrounded by music. I kept every broken violin the academy threw away and fixed them so you could practice at night. You deserved this chance long before today." Tears burned in Sophia's eyes. All this time she thought she had fought alone, but her father had been fighting for her long before she even knew it. She clutched the paper close to her chest as understanding settled deep in her soul. This wasn't about proving herself to the academy anymore. It was about honoring the sacrifices her father had made and taking the future he had always dreamed of for her. She wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and made her choice. Months later, Sophia stood at the gates of the prestigious conservatory that had accepted her. She had left behind the academy that once ignored her, choosing instead to learn from the best musicians in the world. On the day of her departure, the same students who had once mocked her came to say goodbye, this time with genuine respect. "Sophia, we're really going to miss you," one of them admitted. "I wish we had known you like this sooner." She smiled, but there was no bitterness, just calm certainty. "Maybe next time you won't wait until someone wins a trophy to treat them with respect." The words struck deep, and they nodded solemnly, understanding that they had been wrong from the start. As she walked into her new life, violin case in hand, she felt nothing but freedom. No longer the janitor's daughter, no longer the invisible girl mocked for daring to dream. She was Sophia Carter, a violinist who had earned her place through sheer willpower and talent. And now the world would finally hear her play. Some people wait for permission to chase their dreams. Others take what was once denied to them and make the world listen. Sophia stepped into the grand halls of the prestigious conservatory, her violin case strapped securely to her back. The polished floors, the towering ceilings, the air thick with the sound of musicians practicing in different rooms. This was the world she was meant to be in, yet for years she had been kept outside of it. Now she was here not because of privilege, but because of undeniable talent. The first day was overwhelming. Students spoke about their private tutors, the years they had spent perfecting their craft in elite schools. Unlike them, Sophia had learned in the shadows of the academy halls, playing on discarded violins, with no teacher, no guidance, no applause. Yet she had stood on the same stage as them and won. As she walked past a group of students, she heard whispers. Isn't she the one who came out of nowhere? Who wasn't even formally trained? I heard she embarrassed an entire school at that competition. Sophia didn't slow down. She had nothing to prove anymore. She let her music speak for itself. Weeks passed, and Sophia poured every ounce of her being into her training. She practiced longer than anyone, arriving before dawn and staying until the last note echoed through the halls. Professors took notice. Some admired her raw determination. Others doubted her place among them. One evening, after an exhausting session, a senior student approached her. Marco, a violinist who had been hailed as a prodigy since childhood, he watched her with a smirk. "You're good, Carter. I'll admit that. But talent without refinement only gets you so far." Sophia met his gaze unwavering. "Then I guess I'll have to refine it." Marco chuckled, shaking his head. "We'll see if you can keep up. The professors are choosing performers for the International Showcase next month. Only the best get in." Sophia tightened her grip on her violin. The International Showcase was the most prestigious event of the year. Only a handful of musicians would be chosen to perform in front of the greatest maestros in the world. If she got in there, would be no more whispers, no more doubts. She wouldn't just be the janitor's daughter who shocked a classroom. She would be recognized as one of the best. And she had every intention of earning her place. The day of the auditions arrived, and the pressure was suffocating. Students who had spent years preparing were tense, their hands trembling as they took their turns on stage. Marco played flawlessly, his technique polished, every note executed with precision. Sophia watched from the side of the stage, knowing he was good, but he didn't scare her. Because technique alone didn't make music, it was the heart behind it that truly mattered. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage, violin in hand. She took a deep breath and played. But this time, she wasn't playing to prove a point. She wasn't playing for the judges or the students watching her with skepticism. She was playing for the little girl who had once practiced in the shadows, for the father who had sacrificed everything for her to be here, for the music itself that had been her only companion in her loneliest moments. By the time she finished, the entire auditorium sat in stunned silence. The judges exchanged looks before one of them stood. "Sophia Carter, you are officially selected for the International Showcase." Applause erupted, but Sophia barely heard it. Her chest rose and fell as she realized what had just happened. She had done it. Weeks later, Sophia stood in front of a grand audience at the International Showcase, the moment she had fought for her entire life. Elite musicians, music critics, and legendary violinists filled the room waiting to hear the best young performers in the world. She stepped onto the stage, adjusting her grip on the violin, the weight of every struggle, every sacrifice leading to this moment. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and played not just as a musician, but as a force that refused to be ignored. And as the final note rang through the hall, she opened her eyes to see the audience on their feet, applauding louder than they had for anyone else. Some people in the crowd had once doubted her, had once dismissed her, had once looked down on her as nothing more than a poor girl with an impossible dream. But now they knew her name. And from this moment on, the world would never forget it. Some fight for recognition. Others let their talent make the world bow in silence. Sophia stood backstage gripping her violin, her heart pounding louder than the applause still echoing from the last performer. The International Showcase was filled with the best young musicians in the world, children of legendary maestros and students from elite conservatories. And yet she, the janitor's daughter, stood among them, not because of privilege, but because her music had demanded its place. As she stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the audience. She met the gazes of the judges, the skeptics, the ones who had whispered about her behind closed doors, and then she closed her eyes, lifted her violin, and let the first note fill the hall. This time there was no hesitation, no fear, no need to prove anything to anyone. This was her moment. From the first note, the audience was mesmerized. Sophia's violin did not just play, it spoke. It told the story of a girl who had once been ignored, who had practiced alone in empty hallways, who had been mocked for daring to dream. And now that same girl stood under the golden stage lights, making the world listen on her terms. Every note soared through the air, wrapping around the audience, leaving them breathless. Some closed their eyes, letting the music take them somewhere they had never been before. Others sat frozen in awe, realizing they were witnessing something rare, something they would never forget. By the time the final note faded, the silence was deafening. Then it happened. The entire auditorium rose to their feet in thunderous applause. Cheers filled the air. The judges exchanged stunned glances, and one of them wiped away a tear. Sophia stood there, violin in hand, as the realization hit her. She had just cemented her place in history. After the performance, as she stepped backstage, Marco, the senior student who had once doubted her, waited by the curtains. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something she had never seen before: respect. He smirked, shaking his head. "You didn't just play music out there, Carter. You made them feel it." Sophia simply smiled, because that was always the difference. She had never played for perfection. She had played for something real. Before she could respond, a man in an expensive suit approached. Her manager introduced him as one of the most powerful music agents in the world. He extended his hand. "Sophia, your performance tonight was unlike anything I've seen before. We need to talk about your future." Months later, Sophia stood in front of a sold-out concert hall, the first of many. Her name now appeared on grand banners in cities across the world. Her music was played in symphonies, concert halls, and film scores. People who once walked past her without a second glance now paid fortunes to hear her play. But none of that mattered as much as one thing. Her father sat in the front row, watching with quiet pride. He had spent years cleaning floors while others looked down on him, but now the world was looking up at his daughter. Before she lifted her violin to play, she met his gaze for a brief moment and smiled. "This is for you, Dad." And as her bow touched the strings once more, the world held its breath, waiting for the music of a girl who had once been invisible but now stood among legends as one of the greatest violinists of her time.